I appear to be live. Welcome to the Gentleman's Guide to Gaming. Yeah, been a while, hasn't it? If you're subscribed to the Onyx Path YouTube channel as well, you will have seen me on there too, just earlier today, where I returned with the Onyx Path news. But if not, this is probably the first time you've seen me in quite some time. Maybe it's been a while since you've heard my voice. Then again, maybe you're subscribed to the Onyx Pathcast and you hear me regularly. I don't know. As you can see, I'm dressed down for this video. I thought I'd go a bit grungy. I'm sure I could get grungier uh, for a video about zombie survival role-playing games. The reason I'm discussing this, well, actually, there's a few reasons. One is someone actually requested this video some time ago, so it's only fair that I make it. Two is Onyx Path is celebrating its 10th anniversary, and this month is the Dystopia Rising Evolution month. And Dystopia Rising Evolution is a game rife with zombies, viruses, and strains of infection. I'm sure you're all very pleased to hear about that. Now, what that means is later on in this month, you'll actually be able to buy Dystopia Rising Evolution, this zombie horror role-playing game, at 90% off the usual price through TTRPG. That's right, 90% off, because it's Onyx Path's 10th anniversary. They're selling Dystopia Rising for 10% of its normal cost. And they are doing that for DRE, Dystopia Rising Evolution, this month. They'll be doing another game in February, another game in March, and so on and so on. So this feels timely to do a zombie-themed video in a month that has a zombie-themed game being promoted by Onyx Path. Also, it's been a long time, hasn't it, since I was last on here talking to you. So I'm glad to be back. I am always happy to get in front of a mic and start talking to you. The webcam, slightly less. It's, I guess, you know, to be quite candid, because it's been so long since I've been to a convention and spoke to people, since it's been so long since I've been on stream to speak to people, it does make you build up a certain amount of, I guess, anxiety about getting back into it. But I was very happy to do the Onyx Path news earlier today on the Onyx Path Publishing YouTube channel, so I'm feeling more confident about it now, and happy to see people trickling in to view this video right now. That's wonderful to see. This channel has never died. It merely goes into torpor occasionally, especially as it became an elder. One thing you will notice is a lot of the older videos are now private or deleted. I've done a lot of decluttering over the last year, in fact, of videos on the Gentleman Gamer YouTube channel. Just things that, I guess, to be diplomatic, no longer represent me. But more accurately, I just don't think they are worth retaining. The information in them wasn't that good. It's dated badly, I guess. So yeah, I'm not someone who gets sentimental about attachments, as you can see from the fact that most of my Vampire the Masquerade books are sold. I sell through a lot of role-playing games regularly. I delete videos. I'm always deleting memories off Facebook as well. It's just something I do. And so anyway, it's very good to see people chiming into the chat. Thank you very much. Very good to see people tuning in to watch. I imagine if you haven't tuned in, well, if you're not an avid follower of me, and God, I hope you're not, you probably aren't going to be tuning into this live, but you might catch up with it. And if you do, pleased to see you in retrospect watching my video. I can't see you. Anyway, we're here to speak about zombie role-playing games, effective ways of using and playing zombie role-playing games, and specifically running them. And the reason I wanted to focus on Dystopia Rising Evolution is, as mentioned, there's this sale going on later in the month. You can already get it for 50% off if you order it in traditionally printed format from Studio 2. All the links are below if you want to buy Dystopia Rising Evolution. I'll be making lots of references to it as I'm doing this video, just because it's the sort of kind of zombie game I'm focusing on. I'll probably do a character creation video for that game later in this month. Now, by all means, chime in with your ideas as this video goes on. As you know, I've always been very fond of audience participation. So if you've got ideas, things that have worked well for you when you've run your zombie horror role-playing games, I'm very pleased to see your thoughts. But let's get started, shall we? We'll get started with the idea of the characters you play in your Dystopia Rising game, your zombie apocalypse game. Now, in most games, player characters tend to be quite mundane. You tend to be people who have been thrust into an unbearable situation because, quite frankly, it's not too much fun if you're all special ops, if you're tooled up to the hilt, and if you're able to cut through every wave of zombies, especially if you can return to a well-stocked base between missions. You know, it reduces the threat, it reduces the challenge. And so when we think about characters in a zombie movie or a zombie game, we think more about people on the ground level. That's a very good question, yeah, boy Yeti. Are they classic walkers or are they running zombies? We will get on to that. We'll get on to selecting the kinds of zombies you're dealing with very soon. But first and foremost, we want to talk about characters. And the first question the story guide, the GM, should be asking the players is, what were you before the apocalypse? It gives players a chance to actually talk about their character history, just as they would in any other game. What were you before the Embrace? What were you before you took up the sword and started hunting dragons? What were you before the dead came back to life? It's a nice, simple question. You can do it this is a good thing. Either do it as a collaborative exercise, as you would a lot of character creation sessions, or do it one-on-one, because if you do it one-on-one, that can actually create a nice bit of tension in the game. It's far more interesting in these survival games if characters aren't well equipped or are over specialized, which means they are lacking in something. So if you speak to players one on one and it turns out afterwards that you have 3 teachers, a mechanic, and a child as your survivors, then you're going to be lacking in some areas. Maybe none of you know how to fire a gun. In games that are set outside the United States, in particular, that's a genuine concern in a zombie survival scenario, because most of us don't live in cultures where gun ownership is quite common. So also knowing where the game is set is very useful as the person running it. But most important of all is knowing the characters' backgrounds rather than how they've been dealing with the infection. Going on from that, you want to then start establishing the setting. Then start establishing the setting around the characters. And I don't mean at a local level, I mean at a broad level. Is the infection only just beginning? Are we partway through it? Or are we a long way through it? Has civilization fallen? As Arbane has just commented, is this a one-shot or is it a campaign? Let's treat this as a campaign, because I think those are things people struggle with most when running this kind of horror game. One thing the story guide should keep in mind is that zombies are best used not like goblins and monsters that have personality. They can have personality, but as a major point, they're more an elemental force. They're environmental hazards, because most humans in most role-playing games will be able to outrun a zombie, will be able to outgun a zombie, will be able to outfight one zombie. So if they keep coming up against shambling corpses that moan and just try and bite, they're going to lose their luster quite soon. So don't think of the zombie as a monster. Think of it as part of the almost radioactive environment, as parts you don't want to go into that will sometimes encroach on your territory. So when it comes back to characters, something that's worth establishing, and this is something that appears in all the story path games like Dystopia Rising Evolution, on the character sheet, they have aspirations. You have 2 short-term aspirations and a long-term aspiration. Focusing mainly on those short-term ones, it's very much worthwhile speaking to the players and having those players come up with a trivial short-term aspiration and a slightly more important short-term aspiration. What do I mean by that? Well, again, this adds color to a character, and in zombie games, the characters are the focus. They really must be the focus to make the stakes worth fighting for. And if you look at media like Zombieland, for instance, which is a comedy, and Shaun of the Dead, which is a comedy horror, and so on, we have a character who is dead focused on basically capturing the last Twinkie, for instance. We have another person who's focused on getting the girl. Having a trivial objective that is based around a hobby, a work, maybe work before the apocalypse happened, an interest. It could be something like, I really want to find some working batteries so that I can listen to this song on this old hi-fi that I've been carrying around with me, or a power pack, a charged power pack, because while the internet is down, my phone is useless. It ran out of battery a long time ago. I still have loads of songs stored on it, or something like that. Something trivial that adds flavor to a character. And you'll notice again, we don't speak too much about the zombies right now. We're just looking at this as a disaster area game currently, where it is difficult to get this thing. Something we would have treated as mundane, or maybe not in a pandemic, something we'd be able to go out to the shops to do, is something that is difficult in an apocalyptic game such as Dystopia Rising, because there are various zones scattered around the land that are essentially hot, that you can't go into, that are lethal or increase your chances of infection. So now the thing you would have just popped down the store to pick up is a hurdle, a jump, and a crawl to get to it. And while you're doing it, you don't want to make any noise, signal the predators in the area, or bring them back to your base. So when you start thinking like that, but you think about, do excuse the noise in the background, that is a symptom of being a parent. When you think about trivial things that you are interested in, going to see a film, going to get some beer, playing football, just having fun, being able to relax. I know some of you, even myself, might sometimes find it very difficult to switch off and relax, but still it is vital to keeping one's sanity, especially in an apocalypse scenario. So those things. But then you're thinking about your slightly more major short-term aspiration, which relates to friends or family. Maybe this could be, see whether this person survived, see if they have left any evidence of their survival. Maybe properly bury a relative who you know got turned into a zombie, put them down for good so that they're no longer tormented. In Dystopia Rising Evolution, there are different kinds of Walking Dead, different kinds of Shambler, and therefore you need to think that some of them do actually bear intelligence, and you may be of an exorcist point of view that you cannot stand for your wife, your mother, your husband, your child to be stuck in a state, and especially if they're aware of it. So you need to be the person that puts them down. That can be a short-term aspiration. It can be resolvable in a session, or it could be a long-term aspiration if you want, and be something that you focus on throughout play. But these particular character objectives in a game like DRE are vital to making it interesting. I ran All Flesh Must Be Eaten when I was first GMing. I've ran good sessions of DRE and All Flesh and other zombie games, Outbreak Undead, and the upcoming Night's Bleak from Dirty Vortex Games. And the big mistake I used to make when running games like this was I would have characters essentially having to mow through zombies. I was doing it like Resident Evil, and I was so committed to my Resident Evil role-playing game, the experience of Resident Evil, I lost sight of the fact that Resident Evil works perfectly well as a video game, but as a role-playing game is horribly repetitive. It's just monster, 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 puzzle, monster, 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 puzzle. That's not role playing, and there's not really any room for it. So the role playing, of course, comes through the characters, comes through the community, and Dystopia Rising is very much focused on building a community, a safe haven, scavenging for things that you need, and basically making it all stick together, because people are the most important part. So avoiding those mistakes where it isn't about combat and it isn't focused on the monsters but it's focused on the characters is vital to making your survival horror game an interesting role-playing experience. So another thing that a good story guide can incorporate into their zombie role-playing game is the idea of supplies. So supplies are something, again, we don't often think about as as people living in a relatively affluent era, speaking in the main, where we can just pop down to the local store and buy whatever we want or ask a favor from a neighbor, that kind of thing. But I take a lot of inspiration from a game like this War of Mine, but this is also, again, a focus in Dystopia Rising, Evolution, all linked below. In this War of Mine, board game and the video game, both are very similar. There's a strong element of, well, if I run out of X, we'll die. We'll either lose health, we'll get tired and therefore exhausted, our morale will suffer, or we'll get ill and thus infected in our zombie game. And you need to think of those things. You need to think of, okay, so what herbs do I need to collect? What medicine do I need to find? What ammunition do I need to get? What weapon parts? What food? What clean water? Not just water, but clean water, or filters to make clean water, or the expertise. We need an expert who can actually do this kind of stuff for us. We need to find scrap metal so we can make a stove. We need to find a bed and bring it back to the base. And when you think about it, bringing a bed frame all the way from somewhere else to where you are so that someone's got somewhere to sleep, it's actually quite a difficult thing to do when you've got potentially the living dead hounding you. And so elements like that, again, very pronounced in Dystopia Rising, very pronounced in this War of Mine, they give characters something to focus on that isn't just going out and killing. As the story guide, the GM, the person running this game, sending some group out on a mission to just murder zombies is, again, it can be repetitive, it loses its luster, it certainly loses its horror very early on. But if it's more about survival, and that's where things get interesting, you have a shopping list, essentially, things you need to get, places you need to travel to. In Dystopia Rising, as an example, you set up a base and you strengthen it. You are building a community, and that's a central theme of the game. It's my favorite theme of DR. And that means you will often be traveling outside of your base to go and get things that are necessary for your quality of life. But of course, as you pick the area around you clean, you're going to travel further, which means you're going to encounter new threats, whether that be different kinds of undead or hostile humans, raiders, scavengers, and so on. DRE has a bit of a, I guess it's almost Dawn of the Dead crossed with Mad Max tone, because there's a lot of improvised weaponry, armor, devices, mechanics. It's got a wonderful aesthetic that anyone who's familiar with the live action version of Dystopia Rising will be familiar with. And it's something that I think is, well, channeled perfectly well into the role-playing game, and it's something you need to focus on as the GM to keep the players invested in character survival. Now, I'm noticing a few people have commented, so I'll quickly go to those suggestions. So we have Dracos Diabolus saying, may catch some health saying this, but from a character building perspective, watch The Walking Dead. Just a thought. Walking Dead is a decent show for character building. One could accuse it of getting repetitive as it's gone on. My preference in terms of zombie media is the more recent Black Summer. Your mileage may vary with Z Nation, from which it is an offshoot, although it's quite loosely an offshoot, to be honest. It references one similar event, but otherwise the two are pretty different. Black Summer is a series that manages to keep the tension surprisingly high throughout two back-to-back seasons. It has a couple of weak episodes, but for the most part, it's very, very strong, and you're constantly engaged by what's going on, even when it gets quite horrific, or conversely, when it gets quite quiet and introspective, then the tension, the suspense starts to build. So I recommend Black Summer to anyone interested. Yeti also recommends this War of Mine. Draco says Zombies the board game, more like a floor game, fun as hell. I owned so much of that Zombies game, all the expansion packs, things like the circus, the sewers. Yeah, God. Yeah, that was a lot of fun. I remember that. Keegan says zombie RPG hex crawl. You could, yeah, of course, you could do like a hex crawl. More, essentially, that would be more of a, I guess, action focused game rather than the survival side that I guess we're looking at right now. But I don't see why it wouldn't function perfectly well. Train to Busan, another fantastic example of a zombie piece of media. Probably one of my favorite modern zombie movie. So anyway, we also have, yes, and James Ellsbury just points out the Zombie Survival Guide by Max Brooks. That and World War Z make for brilliant books that can accompany any zombie game. So, what have we talked about so far? We've spoken about building character background. We've spoken about building character motivation. We've spoken about the story guides, the seeds of what missions can be. Build up supplies. Now, that's not going to last you for long for ideas, because mission-based games can feel repetitive just by their nature. Unless you mix them up a little, and also it can provoke players or encourage players to not put too much into their character, because they'll think, well, I'm just going out and doing this, and then I'm coming back and I'm going to be safe. It's a little like the living games, the Adventurers League, the D&D and Pathfinder equivalent. Some people enjoy them a great deal, some people don't, and I'm someone who doesn't, but that's because I tend to see them as Gloomhaven without the board, essentially. I love Gloomhaven, but I do think that bringing a character to a group that you don't know, playing through a scenario, and then taking them away again is less about role playing and more about rolling stats, which some people enjoy. I'm just not someone who does. So mission-based games can feel like that after a while. So we'll get into how we can get around that. Arbane mentions 10 candles as well. 10 candles is a brilliant way of setting tension. It's a wonderful inspiration source. You've got some of that similar information in Dystopia Rising. It's got a great chapter dedicated to this kind of information as well. It's a book I recommend picking up regardless of whether you're going to get it in the sale that's coming up this month. That will knock it down to 10% of the price. So yeah, as well as necessary supplies, you can also think of standard of living supplies, quality of life supplies, managing to pick up good food, quality alcohol, not just moonshine, managing to bring back a comfy couch that isn't waterlogged or where the springs aren't poking through, actually getting electricity in your community, or communications. Think of it like that. War of Mine does it like that a little. You've also got XCOM that does it quite well, the modern games rather than the ones I used to play on this channel, where essentially once you've built the base level of your community, then you can start leveling up that community. Are you going to focus on connecting with other communities, setting up a radio, knowing the dangers that could bring because people will know you are there? Are you going to try and build a generator or steal one from somewhere or get the local power plant firing up again? Unlikely. But the point is, you can focus on that community building side, and it gives all the characters something to focus on while they all still have their own unique motivations. When you think of adventures like this, basically what you're doing is making mundane things into adventures. You suddenly make what would have been a normal event become something that can be filled with tension, especially when you think of things like making noise, disturbing scenes. And those disturbing scenes, that can be played two ways. That can either be a scene that is disturbing, or you are disturbing a scene. As an example, the not making noise in a zombie game is a fairly obvious one, but it can be very repetitive to keep asking for stealth rolls. So instead, you need to think of different ways that characters are going to be trying to avoid notice. One of them is going to be to avoid evidence, not because zombies might follow that evidence back to you, although they could. Zombies come in different forms, especially in Dystopia Rising, much like in Left 4 Dead, in fact. If you're familiar with those video games, most people are, but also because of other humans. One thing that could be quite a lot of fun and build up tension, and you can't use it often, but it's a wonderful piece of advice, is if there's a place that characters keep revisiting. Let's say there's a supermarket. You can't raid it all in one go. The next time you go there, Maybe it's apparent someone else has been there. Maybe there's a fight that has broken out there. Maybe the first time you go there, it's pristine. You take everything you need. You live like kings for 2 weeks. You go back the next time. Now there's someone laid out across the aisle. Their guts spooled all over the place. A few dead zombies. Bullet holes in the window. The window's now shattered. It's no longer a secure location. All of a sudden, by the traces of other people, this evidence, these disturbed scenes, or the fact that you may have disturbed scenes, build suspense in the background. I think you can probably imagine how players can start working through things in their mind. You know how players' imaginations goes off off the tracks when in a game of Call of Cthulhu there's a locked door and they are afraid of what's behind it. Well, in this, all you have to do is have something out of place. When they know the environment around them is hostile, then they are going to grow paranoid about what's going on when things look different to how they did originally. Coming across other human groups should always be a big deal in games like these, because I think if you make too many survivors, and this is where, in my opinion, The Walking Dead loses a bit of interest as it goes on, because some communities have grown quite expansive, and it's natural. It's natural as humans survive an apocalyptic event, they're going to congregate, but it's more interesting to play when they're disparate, in my view. It means when you come across different survivor groups, you don't necessarily know their loyalties. You don't know what they're prepared to do to survive. You don't know what they're going to do to you, what they're going to say. Therefore, you should only seed them in like a spice rather than actually making them the main ingredient. Other survivor groups should be something that player characters feel inclined to watch from a distance, to see how they behave, and be afraid of approaching because they don't know. And likewise, those characters who you're about to approach may be paranoid too. They're going to be scared of you because they're going to have had the exact same distant experience from other humans as you have had. One of the wonderful tried and tested tropes of zombie media is how if a character may have an infection. In Dystopia Rising Evolution, infection is a massive part of the role-playing game. Again, fantastic stories abound in that book regarding the different strains of undeath that you can basically contract. It's another one of my favorite parts of the RPG. And knowing that this group that you're talking to, they all look sick. You can't see any obvious bite marks on them if you want to use that vector, that method of transmission, but they all look very, very ill. Now, do you let very, very ill people into your base because they're desperate? Do you keep them at arm's length, knowing that they could die, and knowing that if they die, they will return as undead? Do you kill them now? All these things say something about the player character group, and you can set an entire session around something like this. This is why when I say we need to look at campaign play for zombie games, it's far easier to do a zombie game as a one-shot, because then it is just get out from here, get to there, don't get bitten. That can pretty much be it, and it can be a riveting tale, but it's easy to run. A campaign is harder to run because you need to keep all of these ideas in mind, but as long as you're not constantly throwing them at the players, it means that when you do introduce them, they can be genuinely interesting, they can be scary, they can really ratchet up the paranoia and the moral quandary. And I think those are things you should play with as a good story guide. As a good story guide, you want to be thinking about what scares people in a pandemic. I mean, look at us now. There are people right now, quite rightly, who would suddenly get worried if someone in a store coughed in their face, wouldn't they? I know I would. I know I'd be wearing a mask, but I would still be feeling very threatened if someone just suddenly started coughing right in my face. Now, imagine someone does that in a zombie apocalypse role-playing game. Imagine someone does that in Dystopia Rising. Imagine you trip, and for your exploring the superstore, we're focusing on the supermarket thing. You go through to the freezer area because for whatever reason the freezers are still working. A character goes through alone. the ice has started melting because the power was shut off by the last people who raided this place. You slip, and as you slip into a big old pool of gore. Hell, if you trip, you might land face first in that pile of gore. A zombie may have been shot in here, and now you have just fallen into that character's remains. Are you infected? Are you not? If this happens to a supporting character, especially one that you've grown close to, in story path games like Dystopia Rising, you have connections. This could be a contact, just the same as in Storyteller. It might be an ally or a retainer. They fall in, they come out, they're covered head to toe in gunk. What are we going to do with this character now? Again, what you do is set a story in motion just from a simple event like that. A simple trip up, a simple shelf that's fallen over that hadn't fallen over the last time you were here. All of these things can make a zombie horror game just so much more captivating than pop, 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 headshots kill the zombies. Headshots kill most things. Something I learned when I was playing a Chronicles of Darkness one-shot, which was a zombie game, at a convention, and I've used this subsequently, is represent ammunition physically, if you can. Most cities have like an army surplus store or something like it, where you can buy spent shell casings very cheaply. Or if you own your own gun and you keep your spent shell casings, then you can use these. Now, what do shell casings do? They are a fantastic visual representation of bullets, of shells. And if ammunition is in low supply, and this is why it's one of those good ideas to set these kinds of games in Europe, basically not North America, so that guns are more limited, you can basically say every character starts the session with 5 of these shell cases. It means when they do fire a gun, they have to hand one of those in to you. They have a lovely visual representation, one they can feel as well, that their ammunition is depleting. And imagine their excitement when they find some more of these bullets somewhere. Now they're actually, and maybe there's less bullets than there are, fewer bullets than there are players, and they've got to share them and decide who gets what. Things can get exciting then, a little bit of PvP. I think that could be a lot of fun as well. It's something I use quite a lot. And in John Wick's game, The Shotgun Diaries, there's lots of good stuff in there. But one of my favorite parts that you can use in any zombie game is a timer, essentially. You have a clock. And in real terms, all you need to do is, if a character is in a hostile environment, outside of their base, let's say, in Dystopia Rising, exploring a part of the city, every 10 minutes of play, of actual time, you put another counter down, another counter, each 10 minutes. And like in a board game or any other game where an enemy is basically amassing power, what they could do is unleash one of those tokens at the player characters at any point, and all of a sudden there's one zombie harassing them. But if the story guide is prepared to wait and keep adding these things up while the player characters are hoarding all of the things they need to take back to their base, that the number of tokens increases, so that when the story guide finally decides to drop the axe, it's 10 zombies that have decided they're going to attack all at once. And that makes a difference. On the subject of hordes, numbers in zombie games are a big deal. 1 zombie is easy for people to avoid. 2 zombies, 3 zombies, pretty easy as well. As soon as you get into 5 and above, things start becoming a challenge. In the story path system, this is represented by scale more often than not, rather than having traits for every single zombie. Instead, what you do is you basically multiply the lethality and health of the zombies en masse. So you stop representing them as individuals, you start representing them as a horde. And I really appreciate the scale system for that. I think it's a very elegant way of doing it. Now, something I've spoken about on podcasts before, and it's one of my favorite things to do in a zombie horror role-playing game, is representing the horde as approaching the city, let's say your characters are scouring the city, and then you get the signal there's a horde approaching. Oh dear. Well, that's all right. They're all slow moving in this scenario. And then you get another signal. There's another horde approaching from another way. Maybe this could have been signaled beforehand. Maybe someone in the city was spent ages trying to fix a car, and the engine was revving, and they were making loads of noise. And then they got in a fight with a zombie. They kept hitting their head against the horn. Either way, a lot of noise was made. Then it was calm for quite some time. And now that it's your character's turn to explore the city, maybe they're looking for the person who was trying to fix the car. One horde is coming from the east. One horde is coming from the west. All of a sudden, it isn't just a case of standing and fighting and using all the ammo you've got. It isn't necessarily even a case of running, because by the time you get back to there, wherever it is you need to go, even if you're going north or south and they're coming east and west, they may be able to see you. If even a few of them see where you go, zombies move like packs, and they will move in the direction you are. So can you afford to bring them back in the direction of your base? No. What you're going to have to do is hunker down in the city while these hordes basically collide, shamble, and hopefully move on eventually. All of a sudden, you've got to deal with a new base with more limited resources. You might be stuck in a single room, all of you, if you're lucky, in one building. Can you withstand two hordes coming at you from two directions? As soon as you start playing zombies like this, like natural disasters, like two hurricanes approaching a city from two different directions, you start making the zombies feel like a real threat. Because just like a hurricane, you can't necessarily outrun it. You are told that you need to hide in a bunker, hide in the cellar. That's basically what you have to do. You have to do what, what's his name? Harry says in Night of the Living Dead. You need to get down in the cellar, close the door, and pray. Now, how do you make that interesting? Well, what happens when you go down there and there's already someone in there and they happen to be infected? Or they may be infected, you don't know. What if there's already another survivor group down there? They're not infected, but they're not letting you in without a fight or without a bribe or something. What if they want to work with you to fight out? Maybe they've got someone who's sick and they need to get them out, otherwise they will die. You start throwing all these ideas out there. And again, it becomes more than a game about executing the undead and more about the characters, their interactions with humans, their interactions with the environment. And that makes for an interesting horror game that involves zombies because, again, it's all about survival. And survival is the aim of the game. One thing you can do early on or late on in a zombie role-playing game is, and this is the big knell, I suppose, not necessarily a death knell, but certainly an unpleasant one, is they survive it could be a standard foray out into the wilderness to pick berries or whatever it is they're trying to do. And when they get back, or they could, go through hell to do it. When they get back, their base is a smoking ruin. Maybe it's crawling with undead. Whatever happened while they were out has basically destroyed their home. In my view, it's best to do this early on in a game of Dystopia Rising Evolution. I'm using that example because it's so much about base building and it's unfair for a story guide to just say, your base is now destroyed. But what's more interesting is if at the start of the game, your characters, you've established their background, you've established their motives, you're basically told, okay, it's your turn to go out there on a mission. You get to go into the armory. It's well stocked. You can pick any weapon, what suits you, what suits your character, and one other item to carry with you of your choice. You get to go out, they get to learn the rules, they get to bash some solitary zombie heads in, they get to feel rich because they've looted somewhere, maybe they overcome some traps, and maybe they encounter one demented survivor. They get comfortable in their character's skin, then they come back to their base. This is all in the first session, and their base is a ruin because they didn't put anything into the building of that base yet. Now they have to find somewhere to live. Now they have to rely on each other because they have no one else. They don't have access to the armory anymore. They don't have access to their stores. All they have is what they carry and each other. That, again, makes for a great opening and great tension. Tension is more important in a zombie game than shock. It's probably more important in a zombie game than gore, than any of the normal horror staples, because again, most zombies, whether they're fast, whether they're slow, whether they are zombies from Left 4 Dead, or some of the many monsters from Hell Now's Guide to Wasteland Beasties from Dystopia Rising Evolution, they, which is linked below. Follow that link, by the way, to buy any of those books, and I will get a small amount of money, tiny amount of money, but I would appreciate it. They often lack the character that a lot of player groups want from their villains. And the good thing is, you don't need the undead to be their villains. You don't need them to shock. You don't need them to threaten, because tension is what you should be playing with. Tension or suspense, call it what you like. Leave periods where everything seems to be going fine, because that means when there's the slow creeping dread of something bad about to happen, it's going to pay off all the more. Don't rely on jump scares too much, although you can do it occasionally. You can have the zombie falling out the wardrobe, as in Resident Evil. You could, have the floor giving way and you fall into a pit of unburied bodies. You can do these things, but more you should be relying on the slow ratcheting up of desperation, tension, occasionally alleviating it, allowing the players to feel rewarded for building their base, for building their community, for finding other survivors maybe, or, to reference this war of mine again, turning them away sometimes, or finding a guitar and allowing someone to improve their morale, or the cigarettes or coffee. It's these sorts of things, to go back to that supplies point. We always think of food and water, that Maslow's hierarchy of needs, as it's often referred to. Food, shelter, water, and then you start thinking of comforts. Well, humans are more complicated than that, because humans have addictions, they have habits. There's coffee drinkers, there's alcoholics, there's smokers, there's drug users, there's all kinds of people. Some people can't relax without reading a book or watching a show. Some people desperately need human company. Some people are better off as solitary individuals in order to wind down. Think of these meters, essentially, that each character has, like in this war of mine, for hunger, hunger, exhaustion, and illness, and morale, and how those things are weighed. You don't need to do that for the player characters, because the player characters can be the judge of their own character's well-being. But you, as the story guide, you can determine when the supporting characters, the other members of the habitat, are in desperate straits because they don't have their cigarettes. And you will get players who will resent the idea of their characters having to go out to find a carton of cigarettes for another character because they're not a smoker. And this kind of thing builds interesting character interaction, because you can create conflicts. And as long as that conflict isn't always spilling over into lethal violence, you should have a lot of fun with it. So I'm just going to go to the chat, because I realize I've been talking at length. So what else do we have? A lot of people seem to have been listening intently rather than commenting. So that's good. Dracos says a character that before the apocalypse and a role player LARPer brain full of useless knowledge. Yeah, you could play a LARPer. I mean, it's like playing a reenactor of combat in a game where all of a sudden you have to survive. You know more about making chainmail or forging a sword than most people in the world do. So all of a sudden, the things you've been pretending to do are useful. It's actually a novel character concept, and I think it would work in a game like Dystopia Rising. And long time no see to Riorsex. Skullboy says the best RPG work on the net. I'm more into the soul-based zombie via voodoo or similar spirit-based states. Yeah, that's the thing. It's easy to change the flesh-eating, brain-eating zombies into spiritually possessed or hypnotized, any kind of mindless horde is it functions just as well. And sometimes you have to take your mind out of the white Western experience and put the characters in a habitat, or play a game in a habitat they're not necessarily used to, whether it's an island or whether it's historical, whether it's somewhere more primitive, whether it's, you know, a village that's disconnected from everywhere else. You can start thinking about how these people would survive in this scenario. And it becomes a lot more interesting, I think, if you test yourself like that occasionally. It has been a while, Velvet Tea Cake, since you've seen one of these streams. As you can see from the fact that the light has been downgrading as the stream has gone on, it is getting dark, what with it being winter over here. Duzel says most zombie stories about the humans and how they react to the new world, and the zombies are the backdrop. Quite correct. The last sane one says if the players leave a lot of evidence back to their base regularly, I would probably do the destroyed base story because you don't want them to feel it's impossible. Yeah, there should be punishments as long as they're not sadistic. There's no point making the players resent playing, but having there be penalties, as long as those penalties are apparent. There's nothing wrong with you as a story guide saying, basically, if they fail the role, or you know, having a survivor tell them they found us because of this. It's a difficult thing to balance, but as long as players are aware that there can be penalties for failure, and sometimes that just takes discussing it up front with them. Say, hey, you know, if you really screw up, your characters can get bitten, they can get infected, they might lose some of the loot that they have hoarded over the time, then it should be okay. But it's always worth checking with your players in advance rather than just dropping a shock on them. No one likes to invest dots or experience points in something that will then just get stripped away. That's no fun. Anyway, I've pretty much covered everything I wanted to cover. Hopefully that's given you some useful information. What I would love is if people wanted to check out the game I keep referencing, Dystopia Rising. It is linked right below. If you don't have the money for it right now, well, don't fret, because next week it will be reduced. And this is why I keep profiling DRE. It will be reduced to 10% of its current cost, because it's Onyx Path's 10th anniversary this year, and January is Dystopia Rising month. So timely, I thought, to do a zombie video at the same time as Dystopia Rising is going on sale down to 10% of its cost. It would be silly not to buy a copy, in my view. But, you know, your wallets are your own, so do use them. But, yeah, choose your games wisely. So yeah, Arbane says that's an important point. Make the human characters and SPCs fight and argue about the little things also, rather than always falling into the habit of people only arguing about only the big issues. That is a very good point. Having characters argue about trivial things like cigarettes, like coffee, like the basic comforts that we take for granted, makes characters feel more well-rounded. They're well, I say well-rounded, I more mean nuanced, full of flaws. I think that's more interesting. And that's something you should definitely focus on in games like this, where people are naturally in a state of stress. It's very difficult to feel perfectly all right when you know that if you take the wrong road out of here, you may get ripped apart by flesh-eating ghouls. What a fine thing to end this video on. So I want to say thank you very much to everyone who has tuned in. I've had a good number of people watching, considering I've not done a video for quite some time. I will be doing a character creation video for Dystopia Rising Evolution. I was inspired to do it as I started talking on this one in a few days, so there'll be another video up here soon. Do tell your friends if they want to run a zombie game. This is a good video to check out. And if you want to buy a zombie role-playing game, do click on one of the links below and pick up a copy of Dystopia Rising. You won't regret it. It's a very good game and the art is beautiful. So with that said, I'm going to sign off and say thank you very much for watching for the first time in a long time. Bye-bye.